Welcome to a journey back through deep time, to an era so cold and so strange that it almost defies imagination. Let yourself relax as we drift back more than 700 million years to a period in Earth's history when our planet transformed into something almost unrecognizable, a world encased in ice from pole to pole, a frozen sphere spinning silently through space. This is the Cryogenian Period. The name itself comes from the Greek word for frost, for ice, for the bitter cold that would define these millions upon millions of years. Take a slow, deep breath, and let us begin this story of Earth's longest winter. Setting the stage. The Cryogenian sits nestled within a larger chapter of Earth's story called the Neoproterozoic Era. Picture it as the middle period of 3, preceded by the Tonian Period and followed by the Ediacaran. Each of these names represents tens of millions of years, but the Cryogenian holds a special place. It is the frozen heart of this ancient era, the time when ice reached farther than perhaps any other time in Earth's long history. Imagine standing at the threshold of this period, looking back at the world as it was in the late Tonian. The continents were arranged differently then, drifting slowly across the face of the planet in configurations that would seem alien to us now. There were no trees, no flowers, no animals walking on land. The continents were bare rock and sand, sculpted by wind and water, beneath skies that had never known a bird or an insect. But even before the Cryogenian officially began, something was changing. The evidence lies in the rocks, as it always does. Geologists have found glacial deposits, the scattered debris left behind by ancient ice sheets in tropical regions formed just before the main Cryogenian ice ages took hold. These deposits tell us something remarkable. Earth was already growing cold, unusually cold. The planet was teetering on the edge of a great freeze, poised at a tipping point that would soon send it cascading into conditions unlike anything in the billions of years that came before, or the hundreds of millions that would follow. What could cause a planet to grow so cold? One hypothesis points to the arrangement of the continents themselves. Paleogeographic reconstructions, careful mappings of where the land masses sat in those ancient times, show that large continents were positioned near the equator. Now, you might think that tropical continents would make a planet warmer, but the opposite can be true. Land near the equator receives intense sunlight and heavy rainfall. This combination drives a process called weathering, where rainwater, slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, chemically breaks down rock, consuming CO2 from the atmosphere in the process. Over millions of years, this enhanced weathering could have steadily drawn down the levels of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. And carbon dioxide, as we know, is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat, keeping our planet warm. Remove enough of it, and the planet begins to cool. Remove even more, and the cooling accelerates. Ice begins to spread, and a feedback loop engages. Ice is bright. It reflects sunlight back into space, rather than absorbing it. More ice means more reflection, which means more cooling, which means more ice. A runaway process, elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. So picture this ancient Earth, already chilled, already vulnerable, the stage carefully set by millions of years of continental drift and atmospheric change. The Great Freeze was about to begin. Entering the Great Freeze. The Cryogenian was not a single, unbroken stretch of ice and cold. Within this period, geologists recognize two main glaciations, two great pulses of ice that swept across the planet. The older of these is called the Sturtian glaciation, named after a region in Australia where its evidence was first clearly identified. The younger is the Marinoan glaciation, also named for an Australian location. Between these two frozen episodes lay a warmer interval, an interglacial period when ice retreated and the planet enjoyed a relative reprieve from the cold. These are not brief events. Each of these glaciations lasted for millions of years. The Sturtian alone may have persisted for somewhere between 5 and 57 million years, depending on which evidence you examine and how you interpret it. Imagine that, winter lasting not for a season, not for a year, not even for 1,000 years, but for millions. Generations upon generations of ice, building, spreading, grinding slowly over rock and sea. Recent scientific work continues to refine our understanding of how these glaciations began. In Scotland, on a small archipelago called the Gairvolochs, researchers have examined cryogenian rocks that preserve a remarkable transition. These ancient stones tell a story of warm, shallow seas, the kind of tropical marine environment where carbonates precipitate out of sun-warmed waters, building up layer by layer on the seafloor. But then, the record changes. The warm water deposits give way to glacial sediments, marking the descent into full glacial conditions. This transition occurred somewhere between 720 and 662 million years ago, a span of nearly 60 million years captured in the patient testimony of stone. What triggered the Sturtian glaciation? One compelling piece of evidence comes from massive volcanic eruptions that occurred just before the ice took hold. These eruptions formed what geologists call the Franklin Large Igneous Province, a vast outpouring of basaltic lava that covered huge areas in what is now northern Canada. But here's the fascinating detail. These flood basalts erupted in tropical regions near the ancient equator. Volcanic eruptions, you might think, should warm the planet. They release carbon dioxide after all, pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But the relationship between volcanism and climate is more complex than that. When these flood basalts erupted, they created vast fields of fresh rock, highly susceptible to weathering. In the warm, wet tropics, this new rock would have weathered rapidly, consuming atmospheric CO2 at an accelerated rate. The eruptions may also have released sulfur compounds that formed reflective aerosols in the upper atmosphere, temporarily cooling the planet. The combination of these effects, enhanced weathering, atmospheric changes, perhaps shifts in ocean circulation, may have been the final push that sent Earth tumbling into its great freeze. Close your eyes and picture it. Vast lava fields beneath tropical skies, steaming and cooling, while the planet's temperature begins its long, slow decline. Ice begins to form at high latitudes, creeping down from the poles. Seasons pass, centuries, millennia. The ice continues its advance, indifferent and inexorable. Geological evidence for a planet frozen over. How do we know that the cryogenian ice ages were so extreme? How can we be sure that ice really did reach the tropics, that the entire planet was gripped by cold? The answer lies in the rocks, in the evidence preserved for hundreds of millions of years, waiting for us to read it. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from a particular arrangement of rocks, cryogenian glacial deposits sitting directly on top of tropical shallow water carbonates. Imagine what this means. Carbonates form in warm, shallow seas. the kind of environment we associate with the Bahamas or the Great Barrier Reef, where clear, sunlit waters allow limestone to precipitate. These are definitively warm water deposits. And yet, immediately above them in the rock record, we find glacial sediments, the chaotic, jumbled deposits left behind by ice sheets. No gradual transition, no intermediate layers, just a stark boundary between tropical warmth and glacial cold. This tells us that ice reached areas that had been, geologically speaking, just moments before, close to the ancient equator. The nature of these glacial deposits is itself revealing. Some of them are what geologists call diamictites, poorly sorted mixtures of clay, sand, pebbles, and boulders, all jumbled together in a chaotic matrix. These form when glaciers grind rock into powder and carry debris of all sizes, then deposit it all together when the ice melts. But here's the crucial detail. Some of these cryogenian diamictites were laid down by glaciers that were grounded below sea level in shallow tropical seas. This shows us that ice sheets extended not just onto tropical land, but out into tropical oceans, pushing across the sea floor in shallow waters, where today we would expect coral reefs and warm currents. Another beautiful piece of evidence comes in the form of dropstones. Picture an iceberg calved from the edge of a glacier, floating on the surface of the sea. Trapped within this iceberg are rocks and boulders that the glacier plucked from the land and carried along. Now the iceberg drifts on ocean currents, slowly melting. Eventually, those rocks and boulders are released, dropping down through the water column to land on the seafloor. They settle into fine sediments, muds and silts that accumulate slowly, particle by particle, in quiet water. The result is a distinctive signature, a single large rock sitting alone in fine-grained sediment, obviously out of place. These are dropstones, and they are clear, unambiguous evidence of floating ice. The cryogenian rocks preserve these dropstones in sediments that formed at low latitudes, telling us that icebergs were drifting in tropical seas. Some glacial deposits preserve even more direct evidence of ice, striated pavements and grooves carved into the underlying bedrock. When a glacier moves across rock, it acts like slow-moving sandpaper, embedded with stones and boulders that scratch and gouge the surface beneath. The result is a pattern of parallel scratches and grooves, all oriented in the direction of ice flow. These features are unmistakable, and they've been found in cryogenian rocks that formed at low latitudes, recording the passage of ice sheets across what had been tropical terrain. The ocean chemistry also changed in dramatic ways. During the Cryogenian, iron formations reappeared in the geological record. These are sedimentary rocks rich in iron oxide, and they form under very specific conditions. When the deep ocean becomes depleted in oxygen. In a well-oxygenated ocean, dissolved iron quickly oxidizes and precipitates out, so it doesn't accumulate in large quantities. But when oxygen levels drop, iron can remain dissolved in seawater, building up to high concentrations. Then, when that iron-rich water comes into contact with oxygen, perhaps in shallow areas, or when the ocean overturn brings deep water to the surface, the iron precipitates all at once, forming distinctive banded iron formations. The presence of these iron formations during the Cryogenian tells us something profound about the state of the ocean. Under thick ice cover, the ocean's surface would be sealed off from the atmosphere. Photosynthesis in the surface ocean would cease or decline dramatically, cutting off the primary source of oxygen. Over time, the deep ocean could become anoxic, devoid of oxygen, allowing iron to accumulate. This is evidence not just of ice, but of ice covering the ocean, transforming the chemistry of Earth's waters on a global scale. Let all of these pieces of evidence sink in as you relax. Tropical carbonates capped by glacial debris, icebergs drifting through equatorial seas, releasing their rocky cargo into the depths, ice sheets grinding across bedrock, leaving their scratches and scars, oceans sealed beneath ice, their depths turning dark and oxygen poor. All of this points to the same conclusion. Earth, for millions of years, was frozen from pole to equator. A snowball planet, spinning through space, waiting for something to break the grip of endless winter. Rest now, and let your mind drift through these ancient scenes. The slow advance of ice, the quiet oceans beneath their frozen lid, the patient rocks recording everything, preserving the story for us to read hundreds of millions of years later. The Cryogenian ice ages were real, and they were extreme. And as we'll explore further, they would eventually end dramatically and suddenly, setting the stage for an explosion of life unlike anything Earth had ever seen. But that is a story for another segment. For now, rest in the deep time of the Cryogenian, in the longest winter Earth has ever known. How the ice behaved, and dating the freeze. Let your breathing slow as we continue our journey through the Cryogenian, through Earth's great winter. In the last segment, we established that ice reached the tropics, that our planet was frozen in ways almost impossible to imagine. But now, let us look more closely at this frozen world. How did the ice behave? Was Earth truly a static, lifeless snowball? Or was there movement, change, complexity hidden within that icy shroud? And how long did this winter really last? Take a deep breath and let us explore how the ice behaved. When we speak of Snowball Earth, it's easy to picture a perfectly smooth sphere of ice, static and unchanging, spinning silently through the void of space. But the reality, as scientists have pieced it together from the geological evidence, was likely far more dynamic and complex. Even in the depths of the Great Freeze, Earth was not perfectly still. The ice moved, it advanced and retreated, it thickened and thinned. The frozen world had a pulse, slow and glacial, but a pulse nonetheless. Some research suggests that rather than a single, unbroken sheet of ice, persisting for millions of years, the Cryogenian ice sheets went through cycles, periods of advance, when ice spread and thickened, followed by periods of retreat, when it pulled back, thinned, or even temporarily disappeared from some regions. This makes sense when we think about the complexity of Earth's climate system. Even during an extreme glaciation, there would have been variations in volcanic activity, shifts in ocean circulation, changes in the planet's orbit around the Sun. All of these factors could have modulated the intensity of the glaciation, creating rhythms within the Ice Age, fluctuations that played out over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. The evidence for these cycles is written in the rocks. In some regions around the world, geologists have found Cryogenian glacial deposits stacked in multiple layers, separated by thin intervals of non-glacial sediments. Picture what this means. An ice sheet advances, leaving behind its chaotic diamectite, that jumbled mixture of rocks and mud that glaciers deposit. Then the ice retreats or melts back, and for a time, other processes dominate. Perhaps rivers flow across the land, depositing sand and silt. Perhaps the sea advances over the region, laying down marine sediments. Then, after some interval of time, the ice returns, advancing once more, leaving another layer of glacial debris on top of the first. This sequence can repeat multiple times, creating a layered record of glacial pulses, a stratigraphy of frozen advances and temporary retreats. These stacked glacial deposits tell us that the Cryogenian ice ages were not monolithic events, but rather complex sequences with internal structure and variation. The ice breathed, in a sense, expanding and contracting over timescales so long that millions of years could pass between breaths. Now some scientists have proposed a different vision of the frozen Earth, one that doesn't quite reach the extreme of complete global ice cover. This hypothesis is sometimes called Slushball Earth. Imagine a planet still gripped by extreme cold, still covered largely in ice, but with zones of open water or very thin ice persisting in some parts of the tropics. Perhaps there were leads and polynyas, areas where ocean currents or geothermal heat kept the ice from forming, or where it remained thin enough that sunlight could penetrate. Perhaps there were seasonal cycles in some regions, with ice forming in winter and partially melting in summer, creating conditions that, while still brutally cold by our standards, were not quite the total freeze of a full snowball Earth. This matters because even small patches of open water would have dramatically changed the habitability of the planet. Open water means sunlight can reach the ocean. Sunlight means photosynthesis. Photosynthesis means life, microscopic life, simple life. But life nonetheless, clinging to existence in refugia, scattered across an otherwise frozen world. The debate between Snowball Earth and Slushball Earth is not yet fully resolved, and different lines of evidence point in different directions. But either way, what's clear is that we're talking about a planet pushed to extraordinary extremes, teetering on the edge of habitability. Let's think about the ice itself, its physical properties, its thickness, the way it would have blocked out light and transformed the ocean beneath. Some scientific models indicate that sea ice during the Cryogenian glaciations may have grown hundreds of meters thick over the open ocean. Picture that. Not just a thin frozen crust, like the sea ice in the modern Arctic that measures in meters, but thick slabs of ice, 200 meters, 300 meters, perhaps even more in some places, pressing down on the ocean surface. This thickness matters enormously for one critical reason: a light penetration. In the modern ocean, sunlight penetrates only the upper few hundred meters of water at most, and that's in clear, open water. Even a few meters of ice dramatically reduces the amount of light that can reach the water below. Hundreds of meters of ice would create near total darkness beneath. Any photosynthetic organisms in the ocean, any algae, any cyanobacteria trying to eke out an existence, would be starved of the light they needed to survive. The deep ocean would have been plunged into a darkness as profound as any lightless cave, a darkness that persisted not for days or months, but for millions of years. And yet, even in this extreme scenario, there may have been refugia, pockets of relative habitability, at the continental margins, where the ocean floor begins to slope down from shallow coastal waters into the abyss. Conditions might have been different. Here the ice could have been thinner, or more prone to cracking and breaking. Seasonal variations, or the stress of tides and currents against the ice, could have created fractures and openings. In these zones of thinner or seasonally broken ice, shafts of sunlight could have penetrated at least occasionally, creating belts of marginal habitability. Picture these refugia, narrow zones along ancient coastlines where the ice above is thinner, where cracks open in the spring, where just enough light filters down to support small communities of microbes and algae. These organisms would have lived at the absolute edge of possibility, in conditions so harsh that most life could not survive. But life is tenacious. Life finds a way. And in these marginal environments, scattered across the frozen planet, life may have persisted through the long winter, holding on, waiting for the thaw. Let these images settle into your mind as you relax. The slow advance and retreat of ice sheets, pulsing over millions of years. Possible zones of open water in the tropics, dark and cold, but not quite frozen. Thick sea ice, hundreds of meters deep, pressing down on the silent ocean. And along the margins, in the cracks and openings, tiny communities of microbial life clinging to existence in the faint, scattered light. The Cryogenian was not a simple story of total freeze. It was complex, dynamic, a world in the grip of extreme cold, but still retaining hints of movement, change, and life. Dating the freeze. Now let us turn to the question of time. How long did these glaciations really last? When did they begin, and when did they end? These questions might seem academic, but they're crucial for understanding not just the Cryogenian ice ages themselves, but their role in the broader evolution of Earth and life. Time in geology is measured with remarkable precision using the decay of radioactive elements locked within certain minerals. This is radiometric dating, and it has allowed scientists to place increasingly precise constraints on the timing of these ancient events. For the Sturtian glaciation, the older and, it seems, the longer of the two main Cryogenian ice ages, refined dating has given us a clearer picture. The evidence suggests that this glaciation lasted for several tens of millions of years. Think about that span of time, tens of millions of years. For comparison, the entire history of our genus Homo, all of human evolution, spans only about 2 to 3 million years. The Sturtian glaciation lasted 10 times that long, or more. It was an ice age that persisted for so long that if intelligent observers had been present at its beginning, their entire civilization, their entire evolutionary lineage, could have risen and fallen before the ice finally retreated. Radiometric dating has allowed scientists to constrain the end of the Sturtian ice age to around 660 million years ago. Picture this moment in Earth's history. Not a moment in human terms, but a geological moment, a point in time 660 million years in the past. At this time, the Sturtian ice began its final retreat. The mechanisms of deglaciation, which we will explore in later segments, kicked into gear, and slowly, over perhaps thousands or tens of thousands of years, the ice that had gripped the planet for so long began to melt. But the planet did not stay warm. After the end of the Sturtian, there was an interglacial period, a time of relative warmth, or at least the absence of extreme, global-scale glaciation. But this reprieve was temporary. Precise radiometric dates indicate that the Marinoan Ice Age, the younger of the two great Cryogenian glaciations, began after about 655 million years ago. So, the interglacial period lasted something on the order of 5 million years, give or take. 5 million years of relative warmth, sandwiched between two of the most extreme glaciations in Earth's history. The Marinoan glaciation appears to have been shorter than the Sturtian, but still almost incomprehensibly long by human standards. Current evidence suggests it probably lasted less than 20 million years. Less than 20 million years. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? It reminds us of the vast scales we're dealing with. An ice age that lasts for 15 or 18 million years is, by geological standards, relatively brief. And yet, it's still an expanse of time so great that the mind struggles to grasp it. Imagine living through a single year of winter, the long dark months, the cold, the waiting for spring. Now imagine that winter lasting not just 1 year, but 1,000 years. Now multiply that by 1,000, and you have 1,000,000 years. Now multiply that by 15 or 20, and you begin to approach the duration of the Marinoan glaciation. Generation after generation after generation, across timescales that dwarf human comprehension, the ice persisted. These precise dates are more than just numbers. They allow scientists to correlate rock layers from different parts of the world to understand the global nature of these events, to see patterns and relationships. They allow us to place the cryogenian glaciations in the context of other events in Earth's history: the breakup of supercontinents, the eruption of large igneous provinces, the evolution of life in the oceans. Every date is a fixed point, an anchor in deep time, helping us to build a more complete and accurate picture of how Earth's climate has changed over billions of years. As you rest, let your mind drift through these immense spans of time. The Sturtian glaciation, beginning perhaps 720 million years ago, lasting for tens of millions of years, finally ending around 660 million years ago. A brief 5 million year interglacial period. Then the Marinoan glaciation, beginning around 655 million years ago, lasting less than 20 million years, but still an almost inconceivable span of frozen time. These numbers, these dates, they ground the story in reality. They remind us that this is not myth or speculation, but the actual history of our planet, painstakingly reconstructed from the evidence locked in the rocks. And through all of this, through the slow advance and retreat of the ice, through the tens of millions of years of cold, through the dark oceans and the possible refugia along the continental margins, life persisted. Somehow life held on. The story of how it survived and how it eventually flourished when the ice finally melted for good is one of the most remarkable tales in all of biology. But that too is a story for another time. For now, rest here in the cryogenian, in the deep time of the Great Freeze. Feel the slow pulse of the ice, advancing and retreating. Sense the vast spans of time, millions of years, tens of millions of years, unfolding at a pace so slow it seems like stillness, like a single held breath that lasts for eons. The planet sleeps beneath its frozen shell, and so can you, drifting peacefully through the longest winter Earth has ever known. Ocean chemistry under ice. Breathe slowly and let us descend now beneath the ice. In the previous segments, we've explored the frozen surface of cryogenian Earth, the vast ice sheets that covered continents and seas. But what was happening below? What was the state of the oceans sealed beneath hundreds of meters of ice? The answer, revealed through decades of geochemical detective work, is that these hidden waters were anything but simple or static. Let yourself drift down into these ancient seas as we explore their chemistry, their strange and shifting character, and the ways they shape the future of life on Earth. When we think of the ocean today, we tend to picture it as a relatively uniform environment, oxygenated throughout its upper layers, with dissolved nutrients cycling in predictable patterns. But the cryogenian oceans were profoundly different. Geochemical evidence preserved in the rocks tells us that these ancient waters often tended toward low oxygen levels, particularly in their deeper reaches. This makes intuitive sense. With thick ice covering the ocean surface, the normal exchange of gases between sea and air would have been greatly reduced or cut off entirely. Oxygen from the atmosphere couldn't easily dissolve into the water, and without sunlight penetrating through the ice, photosynthesis in the surface ocean would have been minimal or absent over vast areas. Imagine descending through layers of seawater, moving from the surface down into the depths. In a modern, well-oxygenated ocean, you would find dissolved oxygen at all depths, though concentrations would vary. But in the cryogenian ocean, as you descended past a certain depth, you would enter waters that were anoxic, devoid of oxygen. These dark, oxygen-free waters would have been hostile to most forms of complex life, but they were not lifeless. Certain microbes thrive in anoxic conditions, using alternative metabolisms that don't require oxygen. These ancient bacteria would have been the primary inhabitants of the deep cryogenian seas, cycling nutrients and elements in ways that left chemical signatures we can still detect today. One of the key nutrients that shaped these ocean systems was phosphorus. Phosphorus is essential for all life. It's a critical component of DNA, of cell membranes, of the molecules that store and transfer energy in living cells. Geochemical evidence suggests that cryogenian oceans had high inferred phosphorus levels. Where did this phosphorus come from? Likely from enhanced weathering on land. Even during glaciations, some weathering would have continued, and the grinding action of glaciers themselves would have created huge amounts of finely ground rock dust, glacial flour, rich in minerals. When this material was transported to the ocean, it would have released phosphorus and other nutrients into the water. High phosphorus levels would have promoted strong biological productivity in any zones where there was enough light for photosynthesis. Perhaps in those marginal areas near coastlines that we discussed earlier, or in any regions where the ice was thin or broken, microscopic algae and cyanobacteria would have bloomed in these areas, taking advantage of the abundant nutrients. But here's the crucial feedback. When these organisms died, they sank, carrying organic matter into the deeper ocean. As this organic matter decomposed, it consumed oxygen. With abundant productivity in the sunlit zones and abundant organic matter sinking into the depths, the deeper waters would have been driven toward anoxia, toward that oxygen-free state. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Nutrients promote life. Life produces organic matter. Organic matter consumes oxygen, creating anoxic conditions in the deep. But the upper ocean tells a different story. Nitrogen isotope data, the ratios of different nitrogen isotopes preserved in ancient organic matter, indicate that the upper layers of the cryogenian ocean remained oxygenated enough to support an active nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, like phosphorus, is essential for life. It's a key component of proteins and nucleic acids. In modern oceans, the nitrogen cycle is complex, involving multiple steps mediated by different types of bacteria. Some of these steps require oxygen, Others occur in oxygen-free conditions. The nitrogen isotope signatures from cryogenian rocks suggest that even during the ice ages, the surface and near-surface waters maintained enough oxygen to keep this cycle running. This gives us a picture of an ocean divided, a stratified world where the upper layers held onto some oxygen, supporting an active community of microbes cycling nitrogen and other nutrients, while the deeper waters below were largely anoxic, the domain of bacteria that could survive without oxygen. Picture this layering: sunlight where it could penetrate, illuminating a thin surface layer of water. In this twilight zone, microbes carrying out their chemical transformations, maintaining a fragile nitrogen cycle, and below, in the vast dark depths, anoxic waters, still and quiet, accumulating the chemical signatures of a fundamentally different kind of metabolism. The carbon cycle, the movement of carbon between atmosphere, ocean, living things, and rocks, underwent major disruptions during the Cryogenian. We know this because carbon isotopes recorded in rocks show large positive and negative excursions. Let's pause for a moment to understand what this means. Carbon comes in different isotopes, atoms with the same number of protons, but different numbers of neutrons. The most common isotopes in nature are carbon-12 and carbon-13. Living organisms preferentially take up the lighter isotope, carbon-12, when they build their tissues. This means that organic matter is depleted in carbon-13 relative to inorganic carbon. When scientists measure the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in ancient rocks, they're getting a window into what was happening with organic matter and the carbon cycle at the time those rocks formed. During the Cryogenian, these carbon isotope ratios swung wildly. Large positive excursions, where the ratio of carbon-13 increases, suggest periods when organic matter was being buried in large quantities, removing carbon-12 from the system. Large negative excursions suggest the opposite, periods when organic matter was being oxidized or decomposed, returning carbon-12 to the ocean and atmosphere. These swings reflect major disruptions to the carbon cycle, moments when the normal steady state was upset, when something dramatic was happening with organic productivity, with burial of organic matter, with the balance of life and death in the ocean. Some of the largest negative carbon isotope shifts occurred in what geologists call cap carbonates, distinctive layers of limestone that sit directly on top of glacial deposits, marking the end of glaciations. We'll explore these cap carbonates more in a later segment, but for now, understand that their extreme negative carbon isotope signatures suggest that deglaciation, the melting of the ice, was accompanied by massive changes in the carbon cycle. Perhaps huge amounts of organic matter that had been locked away were suddenly oxidized. Perhaps methane, released from warming sediments, flooded the ocean and atmosphere. These cap carbonates record not just the end of the ice, but the chemical chaos that accompanied the thaw. Sulfur isotopes tell yet another story. Sulfur, like carbon and nitrogen, cycles through the environment, and its isotopic ratios preserve information about past conditions. Sulfur isotope data from cryogenian rocks suggest fluctuations between more and less oxygenated seawater. Sometimes the sulfur signatures indicate more oxidizing conditions, at other times, more reducing, anoxic conditions. This speaks to patchy redox conditions, a technical phrase that simply means the distribution of oxygen in the ocean was uneven, both in space and time. Some regions might have been more oxygenated, while others were anoxic. Or conditions might have shifted back and forth over time as ice advanced and retreated. As ocean circulation changed, as biological productivity waxed and waned. Picture an ocean that's not uniform but patchwork. Zones of relative oxygen side by side with anoxic basins. The boundaries shifting and changing over thousands of years. In one region, during one interval, water might be oxygenated enough to support a diverse microbial community. In another region, or at another time, those same waters might turn anoxic, favoring a completely different set of organisms. This patchiness, this variability, would have created a complex ecological landscape with different niches and opportunities for life scattered across the frozen world. All of these changes in marine nutrient cycles, the high phosphorus levels, the active nitrogen cycle in the upper ocean, the swings in carbon and sulfur, likely influenced the spread and evolution of early eukaryotic algae. Eukaryotes are organisms with complex cells containing nuclei and other specialized structures. They include all plants and animals, as well as many single-celled organisms. The first eukaryotes probably evolved well before the Cryogenian. But during the Ice Ages, they remained relatively simple and rare. The shifting nutrient conditions, the patchy redox landscape, the periods of high productivity followed by anoxic conditions, all of this would have created evolutionary pressures and opportunities. Organisms that could tolerate varying oxygen levels, that could take advantage of nutrient-rich waters when conditions were favorable, that could survive periods of scarcity. These would have been favored. The complex pattern of cryogenian carbon and nutrient cycling suggests strong feedbacks between ice, ocean chemistry, and biological productivity. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the period. Nothing happened in isolation. The ice affected ocean chemistry, which affected biology, which in turn affected ocean chemistry, and potentially even the ice itself. Imagine a vast, interconnected system of feedbacks operating over millions of years. A change in ice cover alters how much light reaches the ocean, which changes productivity, which changes how much oxygen is consumed in deep waters, which changes what kinds of organisms can survive, which changes how nutrients are cycled, which might affect the production of greenhouse gases, which might feed back on the extent of the ice. Round and round, in loops within loops, the Earth system adjusted and readjusted itself through the long cryogenian winter. Modern geochemical proxies, the chemical and isotopic signatures scientists use to reconstruct past environments, have become increasingly sophisticated. Improved techniques have shown that cryogenian oceans were chemically dynamic, with shifting oxygen and nutrient levels. This is a departure from older, simpler models that might have pictured these Ice Age oceans as static and lifeless. Instead, we now understand them as active, changing systems, responding to forcings both external, like volcanic eruptions, or changes in Earth's orbit, and internal, generated by the feedbacks within the system itself. As you relax into this knowledge, picture the hidden ocean beneath the ice. Not a dead, frozen stillness, but a living system, chemically active, stratified into layers, patchy in its oxygen distribution, phosphorus enriching the waters, promoting blooms of microscopic life wherever light could reach, nitrogen cycling through its complex transformations in the oxygenated upper layers, carbon isotopes swinging wildly as the balance between life and death, burial, and oxidation shifted over millennia. Sulfur signatures recording the ebb and flow of oxygen through different regions and times. And through it all, early eukaryotic algae, our distant ancestors in a sense, adapting to these strange and challenging conditions, evolving the capabilities that would later allow life to explode into the diversity we see around us today. The cryogenian oceans were not simple. They were not uniform. They were complex, dynamic, chemically rich environments, sealed beneath the ice, but far from dormant. They were laboratories of evolution, crucibles where life was tested and refined, preparing for the greening of the seas that would follow when the ice finally, permanently retreated. Rest now in the dark waters of the deep cryogenian ocean. Feel the slow cycling of nutrients, the invisible dance of isotopes and elements. Sense the patchwork of oxygen and anoxia, the layering of habitable and hostile zones. This is deep time, deep water, deep chemistry, ancient processes that shape the world we know, recorded in stone, waiting for us to decipher their secrets. Let yourself drift in these primordial seas, at peace in the depths of Earth's longest winter. Life beneath the ice, the great thaw, and climate chaos. Take a deep breath and let yourself settle even deeper into this ancient story. We've explored the ice, the oceans beneath it, the complex chemistry of those hidden waters. Now we turn to perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the cryogenian: life itself. How did anything survive those millions of years of cold? What lived beneath the ice? And when the great thaw finally came, what happened then? Let your mind drift through these questions as we continue our journey through Earth's longest winter and the extraordinary spring that followed. It would be easy to imagine the cryogenian as a time of biological stasis, a frozen pause in the story of life. But the evidence tells us something far more interesting. Life not only survived the ice ages, it adapted, evolved, and may have even flourished in certain refugia. The key to understanding this lies partly in an unexpected source: volcanic activity. Studies of cryogenian volcanic rocks show that intense magmatic activity was occurring even during the depths of the glaciations. Deep beneath the ice, along mid-ocean ridges, and in volcanic arcs, magma was rising, erupting, releasing gases and minerals into the ocean. These volcanic inputs delivered crucial nutrients, selenium, nickel, cobalt, into the cryogenian seas. These might sound like obscure trace elements, but they're essential for life. Selenium is required by certain enzymes. Nickel is crucial for some metabolic pathways, particularly in microbes. Cobalt is a component of vitamin B12, which many organisms need. Picture these submarine volcanoes, glowing in the darkness of the deep ocean, surrounded by plumes of mineral-rich water spreading outward from the eruption sites. In a frozen world where nutrients might otherwise become locked up in ice or isolated in stagnant water masses, these volcanic inputs would have been lifelines, sources of chemical sustenance that could support microbial communities even in the harshest conditions. Around these hydrothermal vents, in the warm, mineral-rich waters they produced, ecosystems could have persisted. Small pockets of biological activity in an otherwise dormant world. But volcanic nutrients weren't the only way life survived. Evidence from microfossils, the preserved remains of ancient microorganisms, shows that eukaryotic algae, including probable green algae, survived under or around the sea ice. These microscopic organisms, far too small to see with the naked eye, left their traces in the rock record, their fossilized cell walls, their distinctive shapes, their chemical signatures. All of these tell us that complex single-celled life persisted through the Cryogenian glaciations. Green algae are particularly significant because they're the ancestors of all land plants. Every tree, every flower, every blade of grass that exists today traces its lineage back to green algae. To find them surviving in the Cryogenian tells us something profound. The ancestors of Earth's forests endured the planet's harshest ice ages, clinging to life in marginal environments beneath or near the ice. How did they survive? Likely in those refugia we discussed earlier, zones where ice was thin or broken, where enough light could penetrate to support photosynthesis. Perhaps they survived as resting spores during the worst periods, germinating and growing during any brief intervals when conditions improved. Perhaps they huddled in coastal areas where geothermal heat or ocean currents created slightly more favorable conditions. However they managed it, their survival was a crucial turning point in the history of life on Earth. Even more remarkably, some Cryogenian successions contain possible early fossil sponges. Sponges are animals, simple animals, but animals nonetheless, with specialized cell types and complex life cycles. If these fossils are correctly identified, and there is still debate among paleontologists, they suggest that the origins of animal life may predate or coincide with the ice ages. This would mean that the first animals appeared not in some warm, benign environment, but during or just before one of the most extreme climate episodes in Earth's history. It's a startling thought. Animal life beginning in a world of ice. Molecular clock estimates, sophisticated analyses that use the rate of genetic mutations to estimate when different lineages diverged, suggest that many major eukaryotic groups diversified during or shortly after the Cryogenian. The ice ages, it seems, were not a dead zone for evolution, but rather a crucible. The extreme conditions, the shifting environments, the patchwork of habitable and hostile zones, all of this created evolutionary pressure. Organisms that could adapt, that could tolerate stress, that could exploit new niches when they opened up. These were the ones that survived and proliferated. When the ice finally melted, these Cryogenian survivors were positioned to inherit a transformed world. There's another crucial piece of the puzzle: oxygen. The onset of Cryogenian glaciation coincides with a stepwise increase in atmospheric oxygen, an event called the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event. Earth's atmosphere had already undergone one major oxygenation event billions of years earlier, when cyanobacteria first evolved photosynthesis and began pumping oxygen into the air. But oxygen levels remained relatively low for a long time after that. Then, around the beginning of the Cryogenian, oxygen levels rose again significantly. This rising oxygen is intimately connected to the story we've been telling. Higher oxygen levels in the atmosphere mean higher oxygen levels in the ocean, at least in the surface waters. More oxygen means new metabolic possibilities for organisms, more efficient ways of extracting energy from food. Complex multicellular life requires a lot of energy, and oxygen-based metabolism provides that energy. The rise in oxygen during the Cryogenian may have been a key factor enabling the evolution of larger, more complex organisms. The ice ages and the oxygenation were happening together, feeding back on each other in ways we're still trying to fully understand. Life was changing the planet, even as the planet was changing life. The Great Thaw. Eventually, inevitably, the ice had to melt. But how? What could end a glaciation so extreme that ice covered the entire planet? The answer lies in a slow but inexorable process: the buildup of greenhouse gases. Even during the depths of a snowball Earth, volcanic activity would have continued. Volcanoes don't care if the surface is frozen. They erupt according to the internal dynamics of the planet: the movement of tectonic plates, the melting of rock in the mantle, processes that operate regardless of surface conditions. And volcanoes release carbon dioxide. On a normal Earth, this CO2 is constantly being removed from the atmosphere by weathering and by uptake by the ocean and living things. But on a snowball Earth, these removal processes would have been greatly reduced. The land was covered by ice, limiting weathering. The ocean was covered by ice, limiting gas exchange. So volcanic CO2 would have accumulated in the atmosphere year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, for millions of years. Models of snowball Earth deglaciation invoke a powerful greenhouse effect from extremely high CO2 levels, perhaps hundreds of times higher than today's atmospheric concentration, and possibly methane as well. Picture this buildup, the atmosphere slowly thickening with greenhouse gases, becoming ever more effective at trapping heat. For a long time, nothing seems to happen. The ice remains, but greenhouse warming scales non-linearly. At some point, a threshold is crossed. Temperatures begin to rise. Ice begins to melt. And once melting starts, it accelerates. Ice reflects sunlight, but exposed ocean or land absorbs it. As ice melts, more heat is absorbed, which melts more ice in a runaway feedback. The deglaciation, when it finally came, would have been geologically rapid, perhaps occurring over just thousands or tens of thousands of years, and eye blink compared to the millions of years the glaciation had persisted. Imagine the planet transforming before your eyes, metaphorically speaking, from a white frozen sphere to a world of open water, exposed rock, and intense heat. Because the greenhouse gas levels were so high, the post-glacial world wouldn't have been merely warm. It would have been super warm, a hothouse with temperatures far higher than anything we experience today. The evidence for this dramatic transition is preserved in what geologists call cap carbonates and cap dolostones. These are distinctive layers of calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate rock that sit immediately on top of cryogenian glacial deposits, often with no intervening sediments. The name cap refers to how they cap the glacial layers, marking the end of the Ice Age. These cap carbonates are found on every continent where cryogenian glacial deposits occur. Testimony to the global nature of the deglaciation event. Cap carbonates often contain unusual crystal fabrics, the internal structure and arrangement of the mineral grains that make up the rock, indicating rapid precipitation in warm post-glacial oceans. In a normal marine environment, carbonates precipitate slowly, and the crystals have time to grow in an orderly fashion. But the cryogenian cap carbonates show evidence of extremely rapid precipitation. The ocean, supersaturated with dissolved carbonate due to the extreme greenhouse conditions and the lack of precipitation during the Ice Age, suddenly dumped vast quantities of calcium and magnesium carbonate onto the sea floor when the ice melted and conditions changed. The crystal fabrics preserve this moment of rapid, almost frenzied precipitation. The intense greenhouse aftermath likely drove strong weathering of freshly exposed rock. Remember, the continents had been covered by ice for millions of years. When the ice melted, it exposed vast expanses of bare rock, ground fine by glacial action, into dust and gravel, perfect for rapid weathering. And the atmosphere was hot, laden with moisture, probably experiencing intense rainfall. Water, heat, and fresh rock powder, the perfect recipe for rapid chemical weathering, which consumes CO2. This negative feedback would have begun to draw down the greenhouse gases that had accumulated, slowly bringing temperatures back from the post-glacial extreme toward more moderate conditions. Deglaciation scenarios include intense tropical storms and strong physical erosion. The energy in the atmosphere would have been immense, driven by the extreme temperature gradients and the massive amounts of moisture evaporating from newly ice-free oceans. Hurricanes, monsoons, torrential rains, all of these would have scoured the land, delivering vast quantities of sediment and nutrients to the oceans. The rivers would have run thick with mud, depositing huge deltas at their mouths. The oceans, enriched with all these nutrients, would have bloomed with life. Any organisms that had survived the Ice Age suddenly finding themselves in paradise, with abundant nutrients, warm temperatures, and the open water. Picture this moment: the Great Thaw, the transition from icehouse to hothouse, the planet convulsing with energy, water rushing, storms raging, sediment pouring into the seas, and life, microbial life, simple algae, the first tentative experiments in multicellular organization. Responding to this flood of opportunity, growing, reproducing, evolving at an accelerated pace. Climate chaos and evolutionary consequences. Step back for a moment and consider the full scope of what we've been describing. The alternation between extreme glaciations and super warm phases represents one of the greatest climate swings in Earth's entire history. From a frozen snowball to a scorching hothouse, and then, after the interglacial period, back to frozen again with the Marinoan glaciation, and then once more to extreme warmth when that ice melted. These weren't gradual transitions. They were dramatic, relatively rapid shifts between climate states as different from each other as can be imagined. For life, this climate chaos was both a challenge and an opportunity. The environmental stresses, the cold, the anoxia, the limited light, the violent transitions, would have been lethal to many organisms. But the nutrient-rich greenhouse aftermath of each deglaciation created conditions for explosive growth and evolutionary innovation. This combination of stress and opportunity helped drive the evolutionary innovations that led toward the Ediacaran and Cambrian organisms, the first large, complex, multicellular life forms that would appear in the periods following the Cryogenian. The dramatic environmental volatility of the Cryogenian likely created evolutionary bottlenecks, where only the most resilient lineages survived. A bottleneck is a moment when population sizes crash, when diversity is winnowed down to a few survivors. These survivors carry forward only a subset of the genetic variation that existed before. But bottlenecks, while destructive, can also spur rapid evolution. The survivors, having proven their hardiness, radiate into the newly opened ecological space after the crisis passes, diversifying and adapting in ways that might not have occurred without the selective pressure of the bottleneck. Think of the Cryogenian as a series of tests, each one eliminating the less adaptable, each one reshaping the tree of life. The organisms that emerged from these crucibles were tough, versatile, capable of tolerating extreme shifts in environmental conditions. They were the ancestors of virtually all complex life on Earth today. Every animal, every plant, every fungus, all of us trace our lineage through the cryogenian filter. We exist because our ancestors survived Earth's longest winter and the extreme summers that punctuated it. This is one of the profound lessons of the cryogenian. Life is resilient, but that resilience is won through trial. The period teaches us that extreme environmental change, while catastrophic in the short term, can drive evolutionary innovation over longer timescales. The cryogenian reshaped not just the physical Earth, but the biological Earth, setting the stage for the explosion of diversity that would follow in the Ediacaran and Cambrian periods. As you rest, absorb the story of survival and transformation, life beneath the ice, clinging to existence in refugia, nourished by volcanic nutrients, evolving in the darkness, the slow buildup of greenhouse gases over millions of years, the sudden dramatic thaw, releasing the planet from its frozen prison, the hothouse world that followed, with its intense storms, rapid weathering, and nutrient-flooded oceans, and through it all, life adapting, surviving, preparing for the dawn of a new era. Let yourself drift now through these cycles of freeze and thaw, through the resilience of microscopic algae, through the first tentative experiments in animal life, through the accumulation of CO2 and the explosive release of trapped energy during deglaciation. This is the rhythm of the cryogenian, a slow, patient accumulation followed by rapid, violent change. Ice to fire, freeze to thaw, death to rebirth. And from this chaos, complexity emerged, setting the stage for the world we know. Rest in this knowledge, peaceful and still, as we approach the end of Earth's longest winter and the beginning of something new. Discovering the cryogenian and the big picture. Let your breathing slow as we come to the final part of our journey through the cryogenian. We've traveled together through 50 million years of ice and cold, through hidden oceans and resilient life, through the great thaw and the chaos that followed. Now, let us step back and consider how we came to know this story at all. How did human scientists, living hundreds of millions of years after these events, piece together the tale of Earth's longest winter? And what does the full picture look like when we consider everything we've learned? Settle in, relax, and let us bring this ancient story full circle, connecting the deep past to the present moment. The human story. The story of the cryogenian is not just the story of ancient ice and vanished oceans. It's also a story of human curiosity, persistence, and detective work. It's the story of geologists tramping through remote landscapes, chipping at rocks, carefully documenting what they found, slowly assembling clues that pointed towards something extraordinary. Early geological clues were identified in unusual glacial sediments in North America in the early 20th century. Geologists working in places like Utah and Nevada noticed something strange. Rocks that looked like they'd been deposited by glaciers, but in locations that had clearly been at low latitudes hundreds of millions of years ago. This was puzzling. Glaciers at the tropics. The idea seemed absurd, but the evidence was there. The characteristic jumbled deposits, the scratched stones, the drop stones settling into fine marine sediments. These early observations helped inspire what would eventually become the Snowball Earth hypothesis. The idea that the entire planet had once been gripped by ice. For decades, this idea remained controversial, even fringe. Many geologists were skeptical. Surely Earth's climate system had feedbacks that would prevent such an extreme state. But as more evidence accumulated from different continents, the Snowball Earth hypothesis gained credibility. It wasn't just North America. Similar deposits were being found in Africa, in Australia, in Europe, in Asia. The pattern was global. Some of the most important localities became classics in the field. Places where the evidence was so clear, so beautifully preserved, that they served as natural laboratories for understanding the Cryogenian. In Namibia, in southern Africa, geologists found spectacular sequences where glacial deposits transition sharply into capped carbonates. You can stand at these outcrops and literally touch the boundary between Ice Age and the hothouse that followed. Two fundamentally different climate states preserved in stone, one on top of the other. The rocks here tell the story with remarkable clarity, making Namibia a pilgrimage site for geologists studying Snowball Earth. In South China, similar sequences have been found and studied extensively. The combination of good preservation, extensive outcrop, and the presence of fossils has made South China another key region for cryogenian research. Scientists from around the world have traveled to these localities, measuring sections, collecting samples, contributing their data to the growing body of evidence that paints the picture of these ancient ice ages. In Scotland, on the small Garvalach Islands in the Inner Hebrides, candidate rock sections have been proposed as a reference point, formally called a GSSP, or Global Boundary Stratotype Section, and point, marking the onset of the Cryogenian period itself. A GSSP is essentially a golden spike, a specific place in a specific rock layer that scientists agree represents the definition of when a geological period begins. The Garvalachs contain rocks that record the transition from the preceding Tonian period into the Cryogenian, preserving the shift from warmer conditions into the onset of glaciation. If formally designated, this remote Scottish locality would become the official definition of the Cryogenian's beginning, a fixed point in deep time. The beauty of this scientific story is its global nature. Glacial and marine sediments of Cryogenian age are widely exposed today across most continents, from the frozen Arctic to tropical regions, from mountain ranges to desert badlands. Cryogenian rocks can be found. This global distribution allows scientists to correlate, to match up rock layers from different parts of the world, to see that the glaciations really were synchronous, affecting the whole planet at once. Each locality adds a piece to the puzzle. Each section tells part of the story. And when you combine them all, the picture becomes clear. Imagine the community of scientists working on this problem. Field geologists mapping outcrops in Namibia, geochemists analyzing isotopes in samples from China, climate modelers running simulations on supercomputers, paleobiologists studying microfossils from Australia. All of them contributing to our understanding, all of them working together, separated by geography and discipline, but united by the desire to understand what happened during Earth's most extreme climate episode. This is science at its best: collaborative, global, patient, building knowledge brick by brick, sample by sample, measurement by measurement. The big picture. Now let us zoom out one final time and consider the big picture, what we know, what we're still learning, and how all the pieces fit together. The evidence is overwhelming that the cryogenian glaciations were globally extensive. Ice reached the tropics. The climate system was pushed to extraordinary extremes. But this doesn't mean the picture is simple. Some studies argue that thick cryogenian carbonate platforms, extensive deposits of limestone that formed in shallow marine environments, lack signs of major sea level fall that you would expect if the ocean were largely frozen. These carbonates found in certain regions imply that not all areas were fully ice-covered at all times. This fits with the Snowball Earth model we discussed earlier, a planet mostly frozen but with pockets of open water, especially in tropical regions where carbonate precipitation could continue even during glaciation. The debate between snowball and slushball is not fully resolved, and different lines of evidence point in different directions. It's possible that conditions varied between the Sturtian and Marinoan glaciations, or that ice extent waxed and waned even during a single glaciation. The reality may be more nuanced than a simple frozen or not frozen binary. What's important is that we remain open to complexity, following the evidence wherever it leads. Scientists have proposed various feedbacks to explain how climate became locked into these long snowball states for millions of years. One important feedback involves sea ice expansion and its effect on the hydrological cycle. As sea ice expands, covering more of the ocean surface, evaporation decreases. Less evaporation means less water vapor in the atmosphere, which means less precipitation, less snow falling on the ice sheets. This might seem counterintuitive, but it can actually help stabilize a snowball state. With less snowfall, ice sheets grow more slowly or even stop growing, reaching an equilibrium. And with less moisture in the atmosphere, there's less cloud cover, which might reduce the greenhouse effect slightly, further stabilizing the cold state. These feedbacks, operating together, could help explain why the cryogenian glaciations persisted for so long. Not just thousands of years, but millions. The climate system found a stable, frozen state and remained locked in it until the slow buildup of volcanic CO2 finally tipped the balance. Overall, improved geochronology, better and more precise dating of rocks, and detailed sediment studies show that cryogenian glaciations were globally extensive but dynamic. They weren't static. Ice advanced and retreated. There were regional differences in ice thickness and extent. There were warm intervals, especially the interglacial period between the Sturtian and Marinoan. The picture that emerges is one of a planet in crisis, pushed to its limits, but still exhibiting complexity and change even in the midst of the freeze. Together, global cryogenian strata, the rock layers scattered across continents, tie together ice extent, ocean chemistry, and climate models into a coherent picture of Earth's most radical icehouse episodes. The glacial deposits tell us where ice was. The cap carbonates tell us about deglaciation. The isotope geochemistry tells us about ocean conditions, atmospheric composition, and the carbon cycle. The climate models tell us what conditions were necessary to create and maintain these frozen states. All of these lines of evidence support and reinforce each other, building a robust scientific understanding. Modern Snowball Earth research integrates field geology, isotope geochemistry, climate modeling, and paleobiology to refine the timing, extent, and biological consequences of these events. It's a multidisciplinary effort, drawing on expertise from different fields, using different tools and techniques all aimed at understanding the same phenomenon. Field geologists provide the stratigraphic framework, the YIU, what, when, and where of the rocks. Geochemists provide the quantitative data, the isotope ratios, the trace element concentrations that reveal past temperatures, ocean chemistry, and biological activity. Climate modelers provide the theoretical understanding, the physics and chemistry of how Earth's climate system works, what conditions lead to glaciation, what triggers deglaciation, and paleobiologists provide the evolutionary context, how life responded to these extreme conditions, what survived, what went extinct, what new forms emerged. Together, these disciplines paint a remarkably detailed picture of events that occurred more than 600 million years ago. We can estimate the thickness of the ice. We can infer ocean temperatures and oxygen levels. We can trace the buildup of CO2 and the dramatic deglaciation. We can identify the organisms that survived and see how they evolved. The Cryogenian, once mysterious and barely known, has become one of the most intensively studied periods in Earth's history. And with each new study, each new data set, each new insight, our understanding deepens. The 50 million year span of the Cryogenian, from roughly 720 to 635 million years ago, represents a chapter in Earth's history that was transformative. It was a time when the planet teetered on the edge of becoming permanently frozen, uninhabitable, a dead world. But it didn't cross that edge. Life survived. The climate eventually recovered, and when the ice melted for the last time, the world that emerged was different. Richer in oxygen, with oceans full of nutrients, with organisms that had been tested and tempered by the most extreme conditions imaginable. The legacy of the Cryogenian is the world we live in today. The complex life that fills our oceans and covers our land. All of it traces back through those ice ages. The evolutionary innovations that arose during or shortly after the Cryogenian. The development of complex multicellularity, the origin of animals, the diversification of eukaryotic algae. All of these set the stage for the Ediacaran and Cambrian periods that followed, when life exploded into the forms we recognize today. As you rest now, let this full picture settle over you like a blanket. The ancient ice, preserved in stone scattered across continents. The scientists working to understand it, building knowledge piece by patient piece. The complexity emerging from detailed studies. The dynamic nature of the ice. The feedbacks that locked climate into frozen states. The regional differences. The warm intervals. All of these details coming together into a coherent story. The Cryogenian teaches us about resilience, the resilience of life, the resilience of the planet itself. It teaches us about change, how dramatically and completely a planet's climate can shift, and how long those changes can persist. It teaches us about cause and effect, how the arrangement of continents, the activity of volcanoes, the chemistry of the atmosphere and ocean, all interact in complex ways to shape the world. And it teaches us about discovery, how patient observation, careful measurement, and creative thinking can unlock the secrets of the deep past. Sleep now, peacefully, knowing that you've journeyed through one of the most extraordinary chapters in Earth's long history. You've walked through 50 million years of ice and cold. You've descended beneath the frozen surface into dark, anoxic oceans. You've witnessed the survival of life in the harshest conditions imaginable. You've felt the planet thaw, transforming from snowball to hothouse. You've understood the evolutionary consequences, the way these ancient events shaped all life that followed, including us. The Cryogenian is over. Earth's longest winter has ended. The ice has melted, the oceans have bloomed with life, and the stage is set for the great diversification that will follow. Rest in this knowledge. Rest in the deep time, the patient rocks, the slow cycles of freeze and thaw. Rest in the understanding that our planet has endured far greater challenges than we can imagine, and has always found a way forward, always found a path toward complexity, diversity, and life.